Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a great joy to be here with you and for those of you who are joining us online. My name is Greg Ellison. I am an associate professor at Candler School of Theology. I also am an alum of Emory College. I graduated in 1999. And I'm joined here by some fellow alums for this panel, Transformation or Reform: How Colleges and Universities Respond to the Afterlives of Slavery. I am joined by my new friends, Dr. Susana Morris and Dr. Robert Patterson. I'll give a very brief bio of them, and then we'll jump right into this conversation. It was pretty clear in our initial reflections on what we would do today that we would really like this to be a conversation. And so what I'll do is I'll frame a couple of questions to get us started. And then we'll open it up for those of you who are in the room, as well as those of you who are joining us online. But first, allow me to introduce my colleague, Dr. Susana Morris. Dr. Morris is the associate professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. She is a scholar of Black feminism, Black digital media, and Afrofuturism. In 2007, Dr. Morris earned her PhD from the English department here at Emory University, and she's previously taught at Spelman College and Auburn University. She's the author of Close Kin and Distant Relatives: The Paradox of Respectability in Black Women's Literature. And she's the co-editor of the Crunk Feminist Collection. I flipped through those pages. It's worth your read. She's also the co-editor of a book called Sycorax's Daughters. Did I get the name right? Sycorax's Daughters. And it's a short story collection of horror written by Black women. Dr. Morris is currently at work on her latest book project, which explores Black women's relationships to Afrofuturism and feminism. Won't you please give a round of applause for our dear friend, Dr. Morris. We're also joined by Dr. Robert J Patterson, who is also an alum of Emory. He earned his PhD in 2007 in the Institute for Liberal Arts. He is currently, laughing about this, he's currently the chair, and he's a professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University. He's not only the chair, he served as the inaugural chair of the Department of African American Studies at Georgetown from 2016 to 2019. Dr. Morris is the author of Destructive Desires: Rhythm and Blues Culture and the Politics of Racial Equality. He's also the author of Exodus Politics, Civil Rights and Leadership in African American Literature and Culture. Dr. Morris is currently working on a book titled Black Equity, Black Equality: Reparation and Black Communities. We're about to have a good conversation, y'all. Dr. Patterson's teaching interest and courses mirror his research projects, and he's taught a range of courses that examine Black cultural production, racial politics, and the legacies of slavery. In addition to thanking our co-chairs who have pulled this conference together, we also want to give thanks to our friend and colleague, Dr. Angelette Tucker, who is one of our contemporaries and also alum of this great university. Friends, to get started, I'd like for us to reflect on the description of this conversation as it's stated in your program. And I believe Dr. Patterson wrote up this description, and it's going to provide us a framework for our conversation. Here's the description as it reads: the conversation will explore the complicated and sometimes contradictory ways that universities have responded to the afterlives of slavery, in their curriculum, hiring, and admission processes and practices in the past decade. And so we're reflecting on the afterlives of slavery and the curriculum, hiring, and admissions processes over the past decade, and how this is both complex and contradictory. And so Drs. Patterson and Dr. Morris, I'd invite you into an initial conversation on this phrase, the afterlives of slavery, which is quite complex even in its construction. And as I was reflecting on that word afterlife, I went and looked up the definition, and two definitions stood out. The first is life after death. And so if we think about the afterlives of slavery, it presumes that we are exploring life after slavery has died. That's curious. The second definition is the later parts of a person's life. This definition leads us to think that slavery never ended, and it persists even in the latter stages of our development in our institutional, communal, and psychic lives. So I'll start with Dr. Patterson. I'd invite you to think about this term afterlife of slavery in relation to the work that you have done on the psychic hold of slavery. And you know, I did some reading in one of your chapters, and you talked about this question: why won't Black folk get over slavery, right? And so what does the afterlife of slavery look like in 2021?
Good afternoon. I'm gonna try that again. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank all of you for being a part of this conversation. To Dr. Ellison for moderating, Dr. Morris for joining me. So I'm going to take both parts of that question. The first being the afterlife, and the second being the question that I in my chapter and we as a collective body of scholars take up in the psychic hold of slavery. With regards to the afterlives of slavery, when I think about that phrase in my scholarly work, when I think about that phrase in terms of the politics of the nation right now, and when I think about that phrase as it relates to the university, I am leaning towards the second definition that you shared this afternoon, which is, in my mind, pertaining to the morphed ways that the logics of slavery, so we can think about the ideas that Black bodies are expendable, the ideas that Black bodies are not human, the ideas that Black bodies don't deserve or are not recognizable under citizenship rights and responsibilities, and how the legal end of slavery opened up the opportunity to transform the ways that those ideas played out, right? And so if we go on a historical journey, when we move from enslavement to Reconstruction to Jim Crow, part of what we're seeing is precisely what the 13th Amendment does. It ends slavery except for a form of punishment. And so part of what we then see is the criminalization of Blackness that allows the logics of slavery, which is the disenfranchisement of Black people, not just in terms of voting, but in other forms of economy, employment, et cetera, getting reconfigured. And that continues throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. So that, I'll bracket that for now, and we can unpack that more later. The second part to the question in the psychic hold of slavery, so it was two questions that animated that work. One was, why can't Black people get over slavery? And the second was, why would they want to get over slavery? And the presumptions of those questions that we were really toying at, which would suggest that slavery is something that can be, quote, gotten over. And so we were pushing back at that idea to suggest that slavery can't be gotten over. And even if it could, quote unquote, be gotten over, it wouldn't be by not talking about it, not representing it, not attending to all of the issues that arose from slavery. And then the second part of that is that it presumes, by asking why Black people can't get over it, it presumes that slavery is a Black problem. Yeah. And that fits into a larger conversation where there's an expectation that Black people are supposed to solve the problems that were created for them, and that that's their responsibility. And it takes the onus off of white supremacy and white racism. And so that is what we were taking exception to.
So we'll continue to unpack these afterlives and how they impact the work that we do on university campuses. But now to invite Dr. Morris to chime in. And Dr. Morris, your research really hinges on Afrofuturism and feminism. And I'm curious how you conceive of this term afterlife and how our connections with the past may shape our present and our future. Any thoughts from you?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back on campus, even though it is unrecognizable to me. I don't know where I am half the time. Is this the duck? Where am I? So thinking about the afterlives of slavery as a sort of, in terms of Afrofuturist inquiry, I want to sort of maybe define Afrofuturism. Are people familiar with the term? Has anyone heard the term before? Okay, so a good number of folk. How many people have seen the film Black Panther? Raise your hand. Okay, so you've seen an Afrofuturist film then, right? It's not the only example or even necessarily the best example, no shade to the film, it's beautiful, but Afrofuturism is a cultural movement, an epistemology, a way of knowing that centers African diasporic culture and life to the continuance of human society and culture, right? So you think about the Jetsons. You remember the Jetsons, and they didn't have a single Black person there, not even the robot, right? When we think about futuristic popular culture and film and so on, music, unless we're thinking about Sun Ra or Parliament Funkadelic or Outkast or Missy Elliott, music and film created by Black folk, oftentimes Black people are disappeared from the future, right? We are relics of the primordial past. And the faster, the quicker we get over issues like slavery and so on, maybe Black folk can then march into the future with the rest of the civilized people, right? That's sort of the nominal discourse, nominal futurist discourse. So what Afrofuturism does is invite us to reposition the past, the present, and the future. Even though future's in the title, it's a little bit of a misnomer because Afrofuturism posits that we can have counter pasts and counter futures, right? So if we're really understanding the significance of slavery to the American project and to the project of the American university, if we really, as Dr. Patterson just mentioned, think about, is this something that we collectively, not just Black people, but we should not get over? Maybe we can have different kinds of futures if we reimagine our relationship to the past, right? So Afrofuturism is a way, and as a Black feminist Afrofuturist, Black feminism is an intersectional discourse, right? That is anti-imperialist, that is anti-racist, that is pro-queer, that is anti-capitalist. There are all these different aspects of Black feminism and Afrofuturism. When they are joined together, also provide possibilities for different kinds of counter futures.
Thank you both. And I'd like to just dovetail on what you were saying. You were speaking about the importance of reimagining and reframing. And I'm thinking about what you said, Dr. Patterson, in terms of Black bodies being expendable and not human and not recognizable and criminalized. I'm wondering what that looks like in the scope of a university curriculum, right? What does a reframing and a reimagining look like? So now we're going to turn to that next part of our description, the complicated and sometimes contradictory responses of universities. So I'd invite you to talk about, in this afterlife, how might we reimagine curriculum?
I'm laughing because I've imagined and reimagined curricula enough in the last 5 years to last until into eternity. But one of the interesting thing about curricula is particularly as it pertains to underrepresented groups or otherwise marginalized, because those are separate and concurrent processes, right? You can be underrepresented and marginalized differently and simultaneously. The exclusion, back to what Dr. Morse was saying about epistemology. So the idea that there are non-European, non-Western ways of knowing that are valuable and valued is one way to reframe and to reimagine curriculum. So in some very specific terms, you look at a lot of colleges and universities, up until maybe the last 10 or 15 years, there was a 2-part European civilization history requirement as a part of a core curriculum if it had it, right? In an English department, you might have a pre-17th century requirement. Well, you probably weren't talking about non-white people pre-17th century, right? And these were things you have to know. At Georgetown, we have a core requirement, 2 philosophy, 2 theology. There's no justification for these requirements other than these are things you should know. And anything else is perhaps added on or seeing where it fits in. And so part of this conversation is about foregrounding alternative ways of knowing, additional ways of knowing. Part of it is sort of, the university talks a lot about interdisciplinarity, intersectionality, but the university is also still very siloed in the way that it's organized. There's still departments, there are hierarchies among departments, et cetera. So part of what reimagining the curriculum looks like is actually debunking and taking away those silos. So even in our African American Studies curriculum, we moved away from social sciences and humanities to a more skill based curriculum that takes up issues that we think are currently present to African American studies and where the discipline is actually going, right? And so we've redesigned that. And so part of it is sort of having the wherewithal to take a chance to imagine what actually you don't see, right? And what's not there. And really thinking about, why is this organized the way it is? It's not by happenstance. We have required now a course that focuses on gender and sexuality as it intersects with racial identity. This is not an add-on. This is actually now a freestanding course that has to be taken. So part of it is what your curriculum is actually doing is setting what you think is valuable for someone to know when they leave from the institution or leave from your department. And so part of what I think is important is sort of knowing the trajectory of where the field has gone, where it is, and where you think it should be going, because you are imparting knowledge and skills simultaneously. And sometimes when you say to people, well, why do you have this requirement? We've always had it. And that's not a sufficient response, it seems, in terms of thinking about what the possibilities are for valuing and approaching different ways of knowing.
And so, Dr. Morris, I'm going to ask if you could take us even a step further back, right? We hear in Dr. Patterson's comments the importance to move beyond these silos, but I think it's also important for us to look backwards a little bit about and think about the trending rise of Black feminism in the university and the rise of Black studies even. And I think one of the reasons it's really, intriguing to hear you talk about this is because you're at Georgia Tech, which is not necessarily considered a liberal arts place. But any thoughts that you might offer? And I think this is still in the sweep of our conversation about the afterlife of slavery.
Yeah, so Black feminism as a kind of critical discourse in the university space and Black studies more generally, you start seeing the rise of these disciplines in the 1970s, really starting in San Francisco State in the late 1960s. And then you start seeing the proliferation of other programs throughout the academy in the 1970s into the 1980s. But, at Georgia Tech, we don't have African-American studies or Black studies. We're starting a Black media studies program, and I was hired in 2017, right? We also have just a Black History Month celebration that is less than a decade old, just around the corner from y'all over in Midtown, right? So the idea of proliferation and Black feminism and Black studies, it has not permeated all aspects of the academic space, I'll say that, right? The other thing I'll say is, for those of us in the humanities, there's been a long-standing, decades-long discussion of the crisis of the humanities, right? If you're in a history department or English or even the sort of social sciences, anthropology and so on, the crisis, right? Because everyone is sort of, everyone is forwarding the importance of STEM education, right? And as you mentioned, I spent most of my career at technical institutes. So save for a glorious small stint at Spelman College, I have taught at places where folks really prioritize engineering, math, sciences, STEM institutions. And most of my students have been engineers. Even today in the African-American lit class that I taught right before I got here, most of my students are engineering majors, right? So when we're thinking about the afterlives of slavery and the proliferation of Black feminist studies and Black studies, we have to consider it within this context of STEM education, right? And what I mean by that is understanding that it's really important that we speak to these students where they are, but also hold them to high, rigorous, humanistic standards of inquiry, right? So the class that I'm teaching right now, I have about 35 students. And I'm going to mention the demographics because I think they're important. I mentioned some demographics that most of them are engineers, pre-med, maybe business majors, right? I would say more than half. Very few LMC majors. That's our version of English and communication having a baby. Literature, media, and communication is a department. Most of my students are Black women. The course is on Black women writers. I have probably 20 out of 35 students are Black women, most of whom are studying to be engineers. They're gonna go on and work at Google, Lockheed Martin, Amazon, all kinds of places, right? They're gonna build bridges. Isn't it important for them to understand Afrofuturism, Black feminism, Black studies and all of that? I think sometimes we think like, if you wanna live a life of the mind, you study this. I definitely was one of those people. I wanna sit and talk about books. I'm gonna go to the English department. One of my mentors mentioned American studies. I was like, well, I get to read enough novels. I don't know that I want to study that. I want to talk about novels and poetry, right? But this inquiry is important for every student. And it's not simply because they're going to get jobs at the end of the day, but I need the person who's building bridges to understand intersectionality. The person who's building levees to understand that Black people deserve to live in the future, right? And you may not learn that literally at home, right? That sounds like home training, but we're really talking about a life of the mind and liberal arts, humanistic inquiry that is valuable for every person, no matter what your major is. And it does not have to be tied to a skills-based outcome exclusively. It's a skill of being a human being.
And Susana, I want to add to that because 2 points that I think are worth emphasizing. One is that Black studies and Black feminism as they were entering into academia, part of what they were doing was making the case for how what you do in the classroom, that education should have transformative outcome in communities and in society as a broader part of the process. And that the situatedness of one's, to use Patricia Hill Collins' standpoint, positionality, that actually matters as a way of knowing and as a way of doing work. And what's very fascinating about that was as those type of theories and thinking was taking place in these units in the academy, the broader institution itself was pushing back away from that. So you see these moves from deconstruction and the situatedness of knowledge. This doesn't matter anymore as Black people and Black women are making gains in academia. And so it's this interesting push-pull there. Another related point I think this panel is getting at, and we may be going here, Dr. Ellison or not, part of I think what we're trying to suggest too is that sometimes universities think that by virtue of now having an African American studies department, by virtue of having an ethnic studies, a women and genders and sexuality studies department, that they have responded to the afterlife of slavery, that the mere inclusion of this department and now a few more bodies that don't look like the bodies used to look, will sort of undo what we're saying has already been sedimented. And so that is another area for possible growth.
Okay. I know there's a program. I'm not. What you just brought up makes me think of a recent article that was in the Chronicle of Higher Education that I keep it in my phone. I look at it every once in a while, and you can go into enter a college or university, and you can see how many tenured Black women, right? Or if you know, if you want to be angry, if you want to feel good, go and look at Spelman's numbers or something like that. But if you want to feel some kind of way, going back to what you just said, Dr. Patterson, about the performance of it all, right? So on my campus at Georgia Tech, the numbers I think go back to 2019. There are 7 tenured Black women on campus at Georgia Tech. I'm one of 7.
And then you divide by rank.
Right, and most of us are associate professors. I think there were 2 full professors, one of whom was my dean, right? So what does it mean to say, yes, we have this program where we're doing this, but you have 7 people with job security and academic freedom in a particular kind of way, right? 7. So if we're not talking about larger infrastructural change, what are we really talking about?
And so let's stay there, right? Because you all graduated in 2007. I graduated 2008, right? Angela, Dr. Tucker graduated 2009. So we're all in the same cohort. I recall when I started my PhD at Princeton Seminary in 2003, I was the first African-American student in my department. Do y'all know how old Princeton Seminary is? And so this question around hiring is also a question about the admissions pipeline. And so that also has a hold on us as well. So I'd invite both of you all to just riff on that for a minute.
I had the opportunity last week to see Gabrielle Union talk about her new memoir. And one of the things she said was that oftentimes you'll hear someone say, which something like you just said, the first in 2001 or the first in 2019, and we celebrate that, but we actually should be ashamed of that. In all type of ways, we are in the process of doing 2 faculty searches in African American studies, and the university is simultaneously trying to give departments more guidance on how to have, how to deal with what they call unconscious bias, or what I call explicit implicit bias, and probably not as unconscious as people perhaps would like to say that it is. And part of what the challenge seems to be, right, is that when there is a pipeline, there's the thought that there is no pipeline, right? There would be more Black women at Georgia Tech if you could just find some who are qualified, right? Because again, and this is not hyperbole. These are the conversations that we've been a part of on hiring committees. Fortunately, I've not been a part of these conversations being in African American studies in the last 6 years, and that is a blessing. I don't have that. I have conversations, but they don't typically look like that, because there's a different set of ideas and ethoses coming to those conversations from the beginning. So when we think about a couple of things, and regular admissions this year for undergraduate education, part of what schools are reporting are higher yields for students of color, Black students, as specifically as the population I'm talking about. Part of what that has to do with is what? The removal of certain barriers that previously excluded them. So the suspension of test scores, for example, at the undergraduate level. So what does a GRE score really tell you about someone's capability in a doctoral program? I'm not really sure. And qualifying exams, or these weeding out processes, right? So the challenges at the base is the idea that we're not trying to build a pipeline, we're trying to weed out who belongs and who doesn't, right? And so if we could reformulate and rethink about what it is that we're actually trying to build in the affirmative way rather than tear down, then I think that would be a helpful starting point. And again, even when you have people, if someone has a terrible experience as a graduate student dealing with faculty members who are not helping them to get the PhD, and they get it in spite or despite that fact, they might be less inclined to move on a tenure track. If you harass someone as a junior faculty member, okay, then chances are they won't get tenure because you were harassing them. If you only have one Black woman in the department and she has to be everyone's master's thesis advisor, doctoral dissertation advisor, she got to play she has to pay the Black tax 5 times over. She's on every committee and then 3. And then you say, well, I wonder why she didn't have time to write. All she had to do was say no. Interesting. Because that right there is a part of a problem that generally happens in society with dealing with inequality, is that instead of having a structural response, is misplaced onto people's behaviors.
Yeah. Snaps to that. Yeah, we want to rebuke neoliberal responses to structural issues, right? At a previous institution, I recall that there was a rule where there had to be a Black person on every search committee. But there were only maybe 30 Black faculty, period. So every search committee, they were like, well, we don't have any Black people in this department. We'll get somebody from math. And they're going to be looking for a historian of religion, right? Whole PhD in math or physics. Not to say that they don't have interesting insight, but that's not really their area of specialty. So that Black tax that you just mentioned, right? Those of us who have an area of privilege, right? You have to put some skin in the game. So if you're at the boardroom table, if you have some power and you can shift structures, it is your duty to shift structures, right? Whatever your point of privilege is. And some of us don't have it. We're not at the room, we're not at the table, we can't bring a folding chair. But if you have it, we have to make moves to change these larger structures, because it's the structures that steamroll over people, right? I can think of, all the various ways in which, I'll tell a personal Emory story since we were talking about the GREs. She is still a faculty member here on campus, Dr. Patricia Cahill. I found this out later that Dr. Cahill wrote a letter in my file saying her GRE scores don't really matter. This person has a really good, came from a great school, has all these great letters of recommendation, look at her papers. Why are we not trying to admit this person when they seem like they're going to be a good student? I had no idea. I took her class. I'm all in Shakespeare and we're talking about Shakespeare, and I had no idea this person advocated for me. And years later, I came to campus and saw, this was only 2 or 3 years ago. I said, hey, Dr. Cahill, you probably don't remember me. I was your student 8 million years ago, but you advocated for me in this moment. She's a white woman, She had power in the room and hopefully to help change the structures. Right now we're seeing this movement to do away with test scores, right? And as a tenured person, I have a point of privilege where I can be in the room and say, not only should we make a personal exception to this one person, we should change the rules in our department. We should talk to our colleagues within our College of Liberal Arts, whatever college you're in. We should go to the institute level committee and change that. Since I am in a USG, community, University System of Georgia, let's change it at the University System of Georgia level. Like, we have to change things at an infrastructural level, right? And so that moment, that really key moment for me, that Dr. Cahill didn't know me, had never met me, didn't see a picture of me. This was before, she couldn't Google me. This was like 2001, right? But saw me holistically as a student, as a potential future colleague, right? And thank goodness for her advocacy in that moment, that she saw beyond my lackluster math score. That's what was holding me back, the math score,
Yeah, absolutely. So people say, well, what are some specific takeaways? Hire more Black faculty, right? A lot more. And to Susana's point, if you want one on every committee, hire enough so people can only serve on one committee. But the second point is, when we think about curriculum, so the trend now is to have the diversity requirements. That's fine. And how does having a diversity requirement help us to fundamentally think about our curriculum? Because if the curriculum we're doing what the diversity requirement was intended to do, you wouldn't need a diversity requirement.
Damn. We're going to do some reimagining in a minute. Now, yeah, you don't drop these mics, but I heard it. So we have a couple of questions that are emerging online, and if there are a few questions that would come from this room, we'd welcome those. But there's a colleague online, and because I guess everybody online can see it, so I'll say her name, Betsy Collins, asks, how can we encourage, and this is about, you know, if you do have a seat at the table that you were speaking about, Dr. Morris, how can we encourage Emory to be more transparent about benchmarks for promotions, as well as transparency and compensation? It's not just about being at the table, but do you have the same status when you are there? And that's such a real, one of my mentors when I was applying said, make sure you get the absolute highest number you can when you come in, because you're gonna get 2 or 3% increases every year, and that's it. And so what does it mean to think about both the compensation as well as the structures for promotion? Because the promotion also means that you get to different tables.
Dr. Patterson just whispered in my ear a thing that he told me when I was negotiating my job to Georgia Tech. So I'll talk about benchmarks for tenure and promotion, but also what you just mentioned in terms of coming in hot with the right amount of money, right? So when I was offered the job at Georgia Tech, Robert and I are close friends, and he is my consultant for many financial matters. And I said, I'm feeling a little afraid to negotiate. One reason, I had just had one previous academic job on the tenure track that didn't really allow me to negotiate. I was like, oh, hey, initial offer, I countered with this. They said, this is what we can give you, take it or leave it. I'm like, Lord, the student loans start very quickly. I don't, so I hadn't had a whole lot of negotiating experience. And Robert said, you should negotiate like a white man. Like, what does that mean? So I started imagine the thought bubbles, right? And what he meant, you could say what you meant, but ask for what you want, exactly. Well, ask for more than what you want so you get what you really want, right? If you really want lab equipment, if you want all these kinds of things, right? And I know that sounds a little bit like lean-in advice, like women aren't negotiating properly. That's not what I mean, right? It means, I wasn't even sure I could negotiate in particular kinds of ways because of my previous experience, because I had literally been shut down and told no so many times, right? I'm not a timid person, but I had not been in that space before, right? And because he had administrative experience as a chair, right? Or as an administrator in particular kinds of ways, he was able to guide me in that way. I think, to speak to the question from our colleague online, there is a private school problem, although this happens at public schools as well, in terms of lack of transparency, right? So when I am mentoring junior colleagues about, now I'm in the negotiator seat, right? This is what you should ask for. This is what you should do. I always say, get most explicit benchmarks that you can get for going up for tenure. If they tell you something like, I'm in the humanities and generally a book is the thing. If they say a book is the thing, or articles, what's the number of articles? What do the articles look like? Are they co-authored? Are they single authored? When they say they want a monograph, can you do it with a trade press? What kind of trade press? With something like the Feminist Press or Rutledge count? Like what, or would they be upset with one of the big five? Does it have to be a university press? What kind of university press? Regional, national, although get very granular, right? But I think it's hard with private schools because y'all have different rules.
Well, and I also want to say that, and this goes back to this question on the afterlife of slavery. These processes are not intuitive, right? And so it requires some guidance, some mentoring in order to move through the promotion ranks. And you need people who can talk your language to get you through that process. So if they're not there, it makes it even more complicated. You have any thoughts?
This issue about who's at the table and who's not. So whether it's tenure, promotion, or promotion, one of the advantages is it's not simply about having bodies in the room. So that's not although I do think having bodies in the room is important, it's not simply about simply representative participation. It's sort of thinking about who knows your work, who knows who to send your work out to, right? And that's not about padding the letters, but that's about, you know, if Susana is doing Afrofuturism, it doesn't seem wise to send her work out to someone who has consistently written about the lack of value of Afrofuturism. One could argue you're setting her up, right? If that is how it shakes out. I think that, to Susana's point, get things as specific as possible. Also knowing that the universities are benefiting from the lack of transparency, because even if they said you need 2 books, what they're going to say in parentheses is necessary but not necessarily sufficient, right? And so there's the quantitative aspect in terms of going to promotion and the qualitative, and universities want to have that wiggle room so that if in fact you've met the quantity, but then for whatever reason, which may not be relative to the work itself, if they have a way out with the qualitative aspect of it, they do that too. But one of the ways to insulate from that, I think, is that sometimes what happens between associate and full professors, that once you become an associate professor with tenure, you may not engage your colleagues in a similar way. They may not read your work as frequently. So there's a way that the system itself allows for you not to have an advocate. And so positioning oneself and just always having conversations. I'm working on this. I'm doing this conference, so that people sort of think of you as being active and making all kind of progress towards promotion, is the phrase I believe they use.
So friends, if there are any of you in this room who have any questions, please feel free to let us know. If not, there are a couple questions online. Okay, Devia Kishore has this really important question for us. How do we begin to implement a curriculum that doesn't introduce Black history until our college years, but is constantly facilitated as discussions even as younger children? How do we prevent college from being the first place that students are exposed to conversations about slavery, Black lives, and legacies?
I currently am teaching the pre-20th. We have a pre-20th century requirement in African American studies. So I teach a pre-20th 19th century, a pre-20th Black life, culture, and thought course. And we were finishing Harriet Jacobs this week. And so I was walking with the students after class, and she said, "This is the first kind of history course I've had too." Now she's a sophomore in college at Georgetown, and I didn't respond to that, to the substance of it, because I was happy that she was there and getting some of the information. The ways we reframe education is not just about what's happening in the classroom. When you go to bookstores, right, and you're buying children's books, are you getting stories where there are Black people who are central and not peripheral to the story and the story? So where are they picking up in that type of media? How are they experiencing Black people when they see them on television or in their communities? So with the fact of hyper-segregation in this moment means that most of the ways that you'll interact with people who don't necessarily look like you will be through different forms of media. But aside from that, you know, one of the most profound things about all of this hoobla-boo about the 1619 project is there are not any lies being told about it, number one. And in addition to that, it's actually trying to do that. It's trying to sort of say, we need to rethink about how history is told and when we start telling that story, right? And 1619 does exactly what Susana and I have been talking about, is it actually reframes what story is at the center point of American history. And so part of what we're doing, we're trying to retrain, primary teachers or public school teachers, private school teachers, when they're getting at the lower grades. You're seeing some departments, I think in Rochester, they've hired a director of African American Studies to work in the public school, who's trying to help frame those curricula and conversations like that. So it's not just within the education system, but I think that you try to find it in these other areas throughout culture.
Yeah, just to add to that, if the questioner is in Atlanta, we have a really vibrant independent bookstore culture in Atlanta. So I would shout out Karis Books and More. I'm on the board of Karis Circle, full disclosure. But Karis Books and More, they have a great children's book section. Little Shop of Stories in Decatur, also in Decatur, totally devoted to children's books. Brave and Kind, a Black-owned children's bookstore, also in Decatur. Decatur is all about the children. So there are lots of places where you could just go on and browse, right? And talk to booksellers, right? That's the advantage of the local independent bookstore to a place like Amazon. Not only are you not giving somebody spaceship toy money, right? You're also giving folks, you're stimulating your local economy and talking to folks who are intimately acquainted. If you're like, I have a young non-binary Black child that I want to, get some books for them so they can see themselves in the pages. Your local bookseller will have okay, here are 10 books, right? They might be on the shelves, they may have to order them, right? But they'll know what you're talking about. So there's that. I've done work with the American Library Association, working with librarians throughout the country on something called the Great Stories Club. And the American Library Association has lots of similar types of book clubs, but you look at your local library and see what kind of book clubs that, I was going to say they're for free, but we're paying for them with our tax dollars, right? So you want to show up and support your local library. They already have clubs, or you can start one where we're talking about Black history, Black culture, and so on, right? Whether you want to talk about super ancient history, you want to talk about the recent past, stuff about local Atlanta or wherever you are. So there are things out there. So when I've worked with librarians for the Great Stories Book Club, I pick a diverse array of books, but I always try to emphasize Black history, Black culture. So we've had students reading the novelization of Malcolm X's life, which is written by one of his daughters. I think it's called X the Novel. The graphic novel series by the late John Lewis, right? March. The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, which is about an Afro-Latina young person. I mean, there's so many books, E.B. Zoboy's American Street. There are all these books out there because oftentimes you may not get it in the classroom. And while we're trying to build the infrastructure for the curriculum, that doesn't mean we can't kind of supplement in particular kinds of ways, right? And so there are all these resources on the internet that we can utilize. So they're out there. Unfortunately, the onus is oftentimes on us, and we are also trying to survive living in the pandemic and live and breathe and all these other things. But folks have done some of this work for us already.
I don't have a question. However, I would like the panel to respond to my comment. I get very frustrated when I hear people say they didn't teach us about Black history in school, because I'm probably older than more than half of people in this room. But I remember when I was in junior high school and high school, and I got an assignment in English to write about a character in American history, I went to the library and looked for books that talked about Negroes' roles in the American Revolution, Negroes' roles in the Civil War, Negro colored Black artists. And I would go through that, take a little effort on my own to go back to my teacher and say, I want to do a book on Benjamin Quarles. I want to do a book on George Washington Carver, or book or a report. And it was approved, and I would report it to the rest of my class. And I spent a good deal of time, and I didn't grow up in a big city, but our libraries had that. I spent a good deal of time making it my job to learn about my history, or my African-American history. And it's just very frustrating to me because the other people, and some people that I've heard complaining, had the same opportunities but didn't take the effort. And I just want to hear your reaction to that.
So one of the as you were speaking, part of the thing that I think was striking was that one of the points about the moment we actually live in now is we have so much, and we have access to a lot more information more easily, right? The internet and the digitization of archives and information that we didn't necessarily otherwise have. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, though, I think that one of the challenges when we're thinking about you know, the opportunities and whatnot. So I think that you taking it upon yourself, and I totally understand that and get that, but I don't think I think that still leaves intact. I think there's a both and going on, right? So what you said is true. And also there's a larger structural critique about you having to have to go to the library and do that because it wasn't embedded in the curriculum in a way that this other information was. So I think it's a both and proposition.
And I would add that not everyone has that same spirit of inquiry, right? I want to talk about it in a way that's not like reifying respectability politics. You know what I mean? As someone who's super nerdy and has been nerdy from birth, enjoyed reading the encyclopedia and the dictionary as a kid, super nerdy. How did I have friends? But here I am, right? I don't know that we can expect that for every student. People have different kinds of intelligences and they might be interested in going down a rabbit hole of tinkering, of fixing things. That doesn't mean that they're not inquisitive or they don't care about things. They might care about different things. And sometimes it's up to us as educators to incite and fuel that interest. I was not the kid that wanted to take things apart and figure out how they work. Doesn't mean I was unintelligent. I was more like you. I wanted to go to the library and be like, well, why aren't they talking about this or that? Right? It also helped me personally that I had a parent that when I came home, I said, oh, I learned about Columbus and he discovered this. And my mother said, you can't discover something that's already there. She didn't say much more else, but I was like, well, what do I do now? Now I'm at the library looking stuff up, right? But my classmates were not necessarily on that tip, but that doesn't mean that they deserve not to know stuff, right? Just because their intelligence or their interest might lie somewhere else. So I think, again, I agree with what you just said, Robert, that it's a both and. Like, yeah, let's have a spirit of inquiry, right? Where we're like wanting to dig and learn. But if you don't have that spirit, that doesn't mean that you're not, you shouldn't have the knowledge, right? Because there's a difference between information and knowledge. Information's out there, but a spirit of discernment to really go forth and find out what's what, that has to be cultivated for some of us, for many of us.
So friends, we're going to take one last question and I'll invite you all, one of you to take it for about 2.5 to 3 minutes. Sure. And we're going to spend the last couple of minutes dreaming together. Mr. Roman.
Yes, I wanted to react to the last questioner as well. I agree, but I'll start by saying I agree with both of the comments made. It is definitely a both and, but I'd like to give some context to it because when you first asked the question, I went at it from the opposite direction in terms of what else could you in the academic space be doing. And I thought it was so important because of the time in which we live. I went through the experience that you described of growing up even earlier, probably, than you. And I was somewhat of a nerd. But you referenced to one of you the student who asked, how can we get to this point of learning before, I think it was sophomore year of college. I was 8th grade of my education before I realized the realities of the Black experience, even in the 19th century, post Reconstruction, before I learned that there were Black doctors, that there were, frankly, Black people who spoke the King's English. Now, you have to realize I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. And so it depends also on the environment in which you're being raised. We can't leave it to our children to teach them themselves. And that was my reality. I had an 8th grade teacher who took it upon himself to teach us something about Black history. It was not in the Memphis Public School curriculum, but he took it upon himself and he was seen as somewhat of a maverick for doing so. But the impact upon us and his students was profound. I took a great interest at that point, and in college became a member of the first graduating class of Black Studies at a major university. Craig Wilkins is actually he is a progeny of the experience that I went through. But I think it's important to understand, I'll end quickly by saying, I had the experience as a 70-year-old of reflecting upon life in Memphis as a young child. And what I remember is Jim Crow and the effects of Jim Crow and on a young child. And it was primarily how it made one feel. And the realization as a student now, that it was that was intentional. It was to make you feel less than, and it was very effective. We can't have future generations growing up with that same impact. We must look to all of the spaces, but particularly in this forum, I'll say, I look to your profession, because I was an African-American studies major, did not go into the field. I went into law, and I've done other things. But there is so much work to be done. And I would offer, just as we see in the political climate, the growth of the political shows, many of us are MSNBC junkies at this point, CNN junkies. Why can't we have a space that is devoted to getting the truth out about the various subjects that you are researching? I found fascinating, Professor, is it Wilkins? Craig. Did I get his last name? You asked him a question earlier? Professor Wilder. I found it fascinating, his field. I would encourage you all, if you would, to figure out ways that you can get that messaging out, particularly with the critical race, the assault on critical race thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, friends, we are approaching our time. We give thanks to our panelists for their depth of insight. And we invite you all to dream with us. What might our universities look like decades from now because of the work that we do today? Peace to you on your journey.